Chapter 13. After all these long months, I'd hoped that my father's crops would be good enough that we could pay my back fees and I could return to school. But the famine debts had been too overwhelming, and as the start of a new school term at Cachoclo grew closer, we still had no money, not even enough for tobacco seed or fertilizer. Without a tobacco crop, we had nothing to sell, which meant we had no money for the remainder of the year. In fact, it would be several years before we were able to plant another crop of tobacco. Instead, we began growing crops that didn't need fertilizer and could be easily sold in the market, such as soybeans, ground nuts, and beans. But even though it was great to have these extra commodities to sell, the prices weren't high enough in the market to make any serious money, certainly not enough to send me back to school. One afternoon, my father and I were listening to the radio while working in the fields when an advertisement came on for a local private school. "Come to Kafuku Private School," an announcer said. "Gifted teachers, excellent exam scores, and easy installment plans. Don't waste time. Come to Kafuku." These schools often bought radio spots, usually torturing me as I sat home doing nothing. But this time, I saw the ad as a good opportunity to raise a question, even though I already knew the answer. "Papa, what do you think? What about this school? What's happening with my schooling?" "Well," he said, "we're looking into it. I hope when all these debts are said and done, we'll be able to send you back." I'm sure it ripped my father apart to get these questions. Not wishing to argue, I accepted his answer and kept on working. That January, I watched as all my friends returned to class, telling jokes and laughing on the road to Cachcolo. I still saw Gilbert and the others in the trading center for games of Baywo, and when any of them said things like, "So William, when shall we see you again at school?" or boasted about their good marks on exams, I said nothing, or simply told them, "Please, I'd rather not talk about it." After a while, no one did. On any given day, you can visit the trading center and see a lot of boys who dropped out of school and are now doing nothing. Instead of farming or trying to return to school, they're hanging outside the Chipiku store in their dirty, tattered clothing, working ganyu all day and drinking it away all night. Many of them become only dark shapes through the open door of the Ofezi Boozing Center, or the zombies who stumble home each morning from the Cachozo dens. At Malawi, we say these people are grooving through life, just living off small ganyu and having no real plan. I started worrying that I would become like them, that one day the windmill project would lose its excitement or become too difficult to maintain, and all my ambitions would fade into the maize rows. Forgetting dreams is easy. To fight that kind of darkness, I kept returning to the library every week, even though I had no idea if or when I'd ever return to school. I kept going so I could increase my general knowledge, and so I would remain inspired. I read all the library's novels, many of them about the dangers of HIV and AIDS, and spelling books to practice my poor English. And of course, I continued borrowing the books, explaining physics, using energy, and integrated science. Lately, I'd become particularly curious about water pumps, refrigeration systems, and ways to make alternative fuels. The windmill had been such a success that I began to feel a bit of pressure. I began to see myself like a famous reggae star who released a smash album and now had to produce another hit. Each day at the library, I pored over my text and tried to come up with my next big idea. The fans were waiting. At least, I hoped they were. Many of those who'd come to see my windmill had suggested similar things. "This looks like a transmitter," or "If you can make this electric wind, you can make a transmitter. That's what it looks like anyway." This made me curious to see how a transmitter actually worked, and after thinking about it for a while, I went to Jeffrey's house with an idea. "Hey, these people are always saying our windmill is a transmitter, so let's give them what they want." "What do you mean?" "Let's build a radio station." That afternoon, we took out two junkier radios from our bag of parts, ones that didn't even have covers attached. First, I wanted to test the theory. One night, a few weeks before, there'd been a big thunderstorm, and I'd gone inside my room with the radio. I was listening to the Sunday Top 20 when a huge crack of lightning exploded in the sky. When it did, I heard a blip on my program, as if the lightning had sliced through the signal. So, taking the two radios, I turned one to a static frequency, then took the second and turned it to the same place on the dial. When this happened, the second radio went silent. No white noise, nothing. As with the lightning bolt, perhaps the frequency from one radio was penetrating the other? If that was true, surely I could put my own sound on top of that frequency. One of the radios I was using was a Walkman with a radio and a cassette player. So leaving the first radio tuned to the white noise, I took the Walkman and switched it to tape mode. I saw that wires ran from the Walkman's tape head to the speakers, so I unhooked them from the speakers and reconnected them to the player's condenser. Because the condenser controlled the frequency, perhaps the cassette music meant the speakers could instead catch a ride on a frequency wave straight to its fellow radio. I put my Black Missionaries tape in the deck. Here it goes, I said. I pressed play. Sure enough, the music played loud and clear on the other radio. The Walkman was now my transmitter, meaning that if I had 5 radios tuned into the same frequency, they'd all be playing the Black Missionaries. Now, Mr. Jeffrey, I said, how can I do this with my voice? So I unhooked the wires from the condenser and rewired them to a separate headphone speaker, making a microphone. I pressed play and began talking into the mic. 1, 2, 1, 2, I said. I could hear my voice coming from the other player. Good afternoon, Malawi. This is your host, William Kamkwamba, along with his trusty sidekick, Mr. Jeffrey. Your regularly scheduled program has been interrupted. After that, Jeffrey and I began experimenting with our little radio station. Jeffrey walked outside with the radio while I stayed in my room singing his favorite Billy Kwanda songs. Even outside, Jeffrey could hear my voice loud and clear. I was really working up a sweat. My ears are bleeding, he yelled, but please, carry on. This is cool. But the farther he got from my bedroom, the weaker the signal became. Beyond 300 feet, the signal just finally disappeared, which must have been the good news for Jeffrey on account of my lousy voice. If we only had an amplifier, we could broadcast to distances farther away. But Jeffrey was scared we would be arrested by the authorities for messing with their frequencies. People were also saying this nonsense about my windmill. You should be careful, or Escom Power will come arrest you. If the first people to experiment with great inventions such as radios, generators, or airplanes had been afraid of being arrested, we'd never be enjoying those things today. Let them come arrest me, I'd say. It would be an honor. Soon, I was attacking every idea with its own experiment. Over the course of the next year, there was hardly a moment when I wasn't planning or devising some new scheme. And though the windmill and radio transmitter had both been successes, I couldn't say the same for a few other experiments. The project I was most anxious to get working was a water pump, which had been a part of my original idea ever since I'd seen windmills in the book. Although the windmill-driven pump wouldn't come until later, I started working on a prototype pump just to play around with the concept. I modeled it after a picture and explaining physics of a force pump, which used a piston and a series of valves to push water through an outlet. The examples illustrated in the book were a car windscreen washer, which I'd never used, and a handheld bicycle pump, which I knew very well. The shallow well at our house, where we got water for cleaning and bathing, was 40 feet deep. So first, I needed to find a pipe long enough to reach the bottom. I remembered seeing some pipes in the scrapyard that had once been used for irrigation and were still buried in the ground. So taking my hoe, I went one morning and started digging them up, a process that took 2 whole days. The pipes were perfect. The first was a wide PVC pipe, which I could use as my outer barrel. I placed it down the well until I felt it hit the bottom. The second pipe was metal and much thinner, perfect for my piston. Mr. Godston welded a round washer to the end of the metal pipe and left its center hole open. Around the washer, I attached a thick piece of bike rubber that would act as the inlet valve or seal. I then had the welder bend the metal pipe at the top into a 90-degree angle to create a handle. When the metal rod was pushed up and down, it created a kind of vacuum inside the plastic pipe. While pulling on the handle, the water was sucked into the plastic pipe, and when you push the handle back down, the rubber seal opened and pressure pushed the water to the surface. The water traveled up the plastic pipe and out the channel hole I'd melted in the side. But the problem was that the rubber valve created too much friction against the plastic pipe. My sisters and even women from the next village had started using the pump, but soon they found it too difficult to operate. I can't manage this thing, my mother said. It feels stuck. I tried greasing the pipe, but the cold water made the grease as thick as jelly, and it didn't spread evenly. I soon gave up. The pump wasn't so successful, but my failure in drawing water paled in comparison to my attempt to create biogas. As I mentioned earlier, deforestation in Malawi has made it very difficult to find firewood for cooking, and gathering wood only adds to this destructive cycle. If there was a good harvest of maize, we usually had enough dried cobs to burn for about 4 months. But once we'd gone through that, the hunt for wood began. Each day, my mother or my sisters walked several kilometers to the small blue gum forest till Kakajokolo to cut down a bundle of thin trees, a chore that took at least 3 hours. Most of these trees were alive and green and had to be set aside for nearly 5 days to dry. This was usually too long to wait, so we burned them anyway, causing thick white smoke to pour from the kitchen windows. Looking inside, I'd see my poor mother stirring a pot of sema, squeezing her eyes closed as tears ran down her cheeks. All the girls in my family developed nasty coughs each year. In Malawi, every woman has this same burden, and I knew that soon these long journeys to find wood would take so long we'd never have our meals. Furthermore, the cycle of deforestation would worsen and create greater problems of drought and flooding. Someone had to save our women and trees, and I thought, why not me? Ever since I built the windmill, several women had asked, does electric wind produce enough power for your mother to cook? Unfortunately, it didn't. My windmill didn't supply enough voltage to power a proper cooker, so I went and searched for other ideas. A few weeks before, I'd been experimenting again with wires and batteries. I'd taken a thick piece of grass, the kind we'd used to build our roofs and fences, and wrapped it within wire about 20 times. I connected both ends to a 12-volt cell and felt it heat up. Soon the wire was glowing red hot and the grass caught fire in my hands. It was a simple, kind of childish experiment, but it gave me my next idea. Okay, I thought, maybe I can do something with this to boil water. I couldn't place a metal pot atop a hot coil of water because it would only act as a conductor. A clay pot would simply crush the coil. So I fashioned the coil like a magic wand, complete with a plastic handle made from a hollowed-out ballpoint pen. These coils with handles existed already. I'd seen them in the trading center, but they were powered by Escom electricity instead of batteries. I hooked a wire to the 12-volt battery and connected it to the coil below the handle. I dipped the coil into the water. In about 5 minutes, it was boiling. But this was too simple. I had to go bigger. My integrated science book had a small section on alternative fuels, such as solar power and hydro, both of which I'd studied. But it also mentioned something called biogas, which was made by converting animal waste into liquid fuel, which could then be used for cooking. It explained how the animal waste was buried in a pit. As it heated up over a matter of months, the gas it produced could be tapped through a long valve. I don't need a pit, I thought, and I certainly don't need to wait that long. Devising my own plan, I snuck into my mother's kitchen and snatched the big round clay pot she used for making beans. All I needed now was the organic matter, and I didn't have to look far. Across the compound, Aunt Chrissy kept 2 goats in a wooden pen behind her house. The ground was covered in their marble-shaped poop. Taking the sugar bag, I made sure nobody was looking and climbed over the fence and into the pen. The goats retreated to the corner and looked at me strangely, but I carried on. I filled the sack until it was spilling over and walked back to the kitchen. My mother was out working in the garden, which gave me plenty of time and space to work. I dumped the poop into the clay pot and filled it halfway with water until the brown marbles were swimming around. Then I covered the top with plastic jumbos and tried a rope around the lip of the bowl, sealing it tight. For my valve, I clipped the top off a radio antenna, creating a hollow tube, then poked it through the center of the plastic. I then corked the top with a reed. My mother's fire was still warm from breakfast, so I added a handful of maize piths and blew until the fire caught life. I placed the pot in the center and waited for the greatness. About 15 minutes later, I heard a rumbling inside the pot, and the water began to boil. The plastic puffs and the distance from the and danced from the steam, but the rope held tight. My heart began to flutter. I'd give it a few more seconds before starting the final test. Suddenly, I heard a voice behind me. My mother. "What's that smell?" she shouted. "Biogas! It's horrible!" By now the plastic was rumbling like mad, ready to blow. I had to act quickly. It was time to remove the reed and proceed with ignition. I reached over and quickly popped out the reed, and when I did, a pipe of silver steam came rushing out the top. My mother was right. It smelled vile. I'd set aside a long piece of grass, so I grabbed it now and poked it to the fire, catching a flame. "Stand back!" I shouted. "This could be dangerous." "What?" I stood up and ran to the door, pushing my mother aside. With half my body shielded by the door frame, I stretched out my arm, inching the flame closer and closer. "Here it goes," I said. I touched the fire to the piping steam and clenched my eyes to shield them from the flash. But when the flame touched the gas, all it did was sputter out and die. When I opened my eyes, I saw that all I saw was a piece of grass dripping with foul water. My mother was furious. "Look what you've done. You've ruined my best cooking pot. Boiling goat's poop. I can't believe it. Wait until I tell your father." I wanted to explain that I'd done it for her sake, but I guessed it wasn't the right time. In late 2003, while I read books under our mango tree and tinkered with my experiments, my mother went to visit her parents in Salima and stayed for 2 weeks. Salima is by the lake and very hot, and the mosquitoes there are like small vicious birds. When my mother returned home, she developed a high fever and dizziness. Then every part of her body began to quiver, as if it plunged into an icy bath. We all knew it was malaria. In sub-Saharan Africa, almost everyone gets malaria at some point. Most people first contract the virus in their childhood. If they don't use proper bed netting to keep from getting mosquito bites, they'll continue to get infected each year until they're old and gray. Because we didn't have nets at my house, malaria was a yearly problem for us all. If we caught the virus in time and took the medicine provided by the clinic, we'd feel better in a week or two. But some stubborn strains of the virus are more ferocious and attack the brain, and they're harder to treat. Every year in Africa, malaria kills over 1 million people, many of them children. My mother's symptoms seemed normal, so we put her to bed and made plans to get her some medicine the following day. But as with my sister Mayless, the fever kept getting worse. By morning, my mother was vomiting and shaking even more, and she could no longer speak. Her breathing became so heavy I could hear it across the corridor in my room. By noon, she'd lost the feeling in her legs. Our village doesn't have an ambulance, so my father hoisted my mother onto his bicycle and told her to hold on, and pushed her to the clinic near the trading center. The nurses took one look at her and demanded that she be rushed immediately to the Anglican hospital in Mutumamba. My father quickly flagged down a pickup and loaded her in the back. In the waiting room at Mutumamba, the doctor said, "What are your symptoms?" "I can't really walk," my mother said. "My legs are paralyzed." After testing positive for malaria, the doctors gave her 2 injections in the leg. But there were no free beds at the hospital, so the doctor sent her home. 2 days later, my mother began slipping into a coma. The morning it happened, we managed to get her to her feet and walk her outside. We lifted her onto the bicycle, doing our best to keep her from falling off the saddle. "Mama, you have to hold on," I said, but it was no use. As we pushed her down the trail, her limp body kept collapsing like a sack of beans. Her head rolled back, so I grabbed a handful of hair and held her up. "Don't worry," my father kept telling my mother, the fear straining his voice. "Just try to hold on until we get onto the road. We're taking you to the hospital now. They'll fix you up and make you better." The pickup stop was just a small space under the mango trees near the Glencoe Primary School. Once there, we gently pulled my mother off the bike and laid her on the grass. In minutes, a pickup came rumbling from the trading center, headed for Kasungu. My father waved it down. "Make way," he screamed. "My wife is sick." About 10 minutes About 10 people were squeezed in the back of the truck, along with crates of empty Coke bottles and a few sacks of maize. When the passengers saw my mother, several of them jumped out and made room. "It's bad malaria," my father shouted to the driver. "Take us to Mutamba." We slid her into the bed of the truck and leaned her back against the cab. My father sat beside her, holding her body and placing her head against his shoulder. The road to Matumba was filled with holes and bumps, and laying her flat would only rattle her body against the bed. "Look after your sisters, William," my father said. "Tell my sister Chrissy and the others where we've gone." And like that, the truck sped away. The truck reached the hospital in 15 minutes. Once there, my father carried my mother in his arms through the door. "We need to see the doctor now," he shouted. My mother was quickly admitted into a room, where the doctors administered an IV drip to battle the virus. "This doesn't look promising," the doctor said. "It appears it's gone to her brain." The room had pink walls and ESCOM-powered lights. Various posters on the walls showed people suffering from different diseases, things like AIDS, tuberculosis, and gonorrhea. Another woman lay in a bed beside my mother. She was from Chimama and kept vomiting into a bag. That afternoon, my Aunt Chrissy and Socrates' wife Mary arrived and stayed through the night, keeping vigil. My father came home to try to sell some maize and soybeans to pay the medical fees. He was quiet and kept pacing the courtyard, as if he was waiting for something. "Papa, is Mama going to be okay?" Mavis asked. "She's very sick. Pray for your mother." My father was able to sell a few kilos of grain the next morning in the trading center, and he immediately returned to the hospital. I volunteered to stay home and watch my sisters. I was also too afraid to see my mother in such a state. The next day, when I finally did get the courage to go, I quickly regretted it. My mother's dark skin looked drained of color against the white sheets, and her lips were dry and cracked. Her chest rose and fell from her labored breasts like a toy boat on the waves. Her eyes were closed, but her eyeballs were dancing inside. My mother later told me that deep in the recesses of her darkness, she'd already accepted death. She'd given up her fight and was waiting for Jesus to come and take her. But something wouldn't allow her to depart. She'd feel her body sinking through the bed, only to rise up again. When this happened, her eyes popped open, and she saw people she knew standing above her. Everything would go dark again, and the cycle would repeat. Seeing all those people made her remember her children. At one point in her darkness, she saw a vision of Tia Maike, so young and still so fragile. In the dream, she was alone and frightened because her mother was dead. Thinking of her daughter, my mother struggled to free herself from the blackness for good. It was a terrible fight, which explained why her eyes kept squirming like termites. When she managed to break free and open her eyes, she saw me standing there. "Tia Maike!" she screamed. "Where's Tia Maike? Where's my baby?" I jumped back as if she were a snake. Her eyes were wide and pulsing with fear. "Tia Maike!" "Tia Maike's at home," my aunt said. "You'll see her soon. Don't worry." Slowly, as if being deflated of air, my mother then slipped back into darkness. Every time she came back, she'd scream my sister's name again. Seeing your mother like this is like having God steal the sky from over your head. I was certain she was going to die, and witnessing this made it even more emotional. But after several days, her fever miraculously broke. I'd never prayed so hard in my life. Not long after my mother came home, Gilbert told me that his father wasn't doing so well. Ever since the beating by the president's thugs, the chief had lived in fear for his life, and his health had grown worse. Whenever I visited, he always appeared quiet and weak, and lately he'd lost a lot of weight. I saw him sleeping on the sofa or taking walks alone in his fields when the sun was warm. But because he was the chief, I never really spoke to him. It wasn't my place as a young man. A few months later, when I was visiting Jeffrey at the maize mill in Chipumba, we passed some women on the road who said they had some bad news. "Brothers, our Chief Wimbe is no more," they said, tears in their eyes. Jeffrey and I got on my bike and tried to hurry home, but my tire burst and I had to push. While we were struggling with the bike, preparations for the funeral had already begun. A stream of cars and trucks rumbled past. The lorries were filled with chickens and goats and great bags of flour to feed all the guests, who were already arriving to honor the chief. Dozens of village women were also on their way back to cook for mourners. All of these people were silent as they passed. Not one radio could be heard. Once the traffic had cleared, I heard the great pounding of a drum like none I'd ever heard. A dull boom like a hammer banging the very shell of the sky. A chief was dead. Hundreds of people were gathered around Gilbert's house when we arrived. I saw my parents and sisters and aunts and uncles, along with all the traders from the market. Women ran back and forth carrying buckets of water on their heads. Others hunched over fires, wrapped in wood smoke and sweating as they stirred giant pots of sema. A church choir stood under the blue gum softly singing "The World Is Not My Home," while a steady line of people poured out of Gilbert's front door, wailing and screaming. "Our king has left us," they cried. "What will we do?" Geoffrey and I sat down under a tree and waited. Soon someone came and said Gilbert was ready to see us. He was sitting on the other side of the house under some trees. My friend looked like he was in shock, even though he was trying to stay strong for his mother. Seeing him filled me with sadness. "I heard about your father," I said. "You know I'm here for you in this terrible time. God is in control." I didn't know what else to say, so I just remained silent and comforted my friend. The funeral ceremony was held in the yard of the primary school underneath the big blue gums. A light rain started falling. Someone erected a large canopy for the family and delegation of chiefs and officials who had arrived from all over. They crowded under the shelter while hundreds of villagers huddled outside, moaning and sobbing in the downpour. Up front, the chief's body lay in a closed wooden coffin covered in wildflowers. Every church and mosque around Limbe was in attendance. Their choirs took turns huddled around the wooden box singing songs in Chichewa. When they finished, the silence was broken by the banging of the drum. The funeral dirge was slow and steady, then rose in tempo. Atop a fast and furious rhythm, out walked by the Guliwamkulu. More than 50 of them pressed around the coffin, each wearing black masks in the shape of cows' heads, with long exaggerated snouts, black horns, and round bulging eyes. The mystical dancers had been there for days, camping behind Gilbert's house and huddled around their fires, never revealing their faces. Now several of them broke free from the group, their bodies locked in spasms as they began to dance. They crouched low in unison and kicked out their legs, sweeping their arms over the red soil as if telling the earth it was about to receive our chief. After the dancing, the funeral procession filed down to the graveyard near the Catholic church. The chief's grave had been dug, much like Uncle John's, with a similar compartment at the base of the pit. Prayers were said and wreaths were laid on the coffin. Mr. Ngwata, the chief's messenger, appeared in his khaki policeman's uniform and fired a shotgun into the air. With our ears ringing and faces stinging from tears, we watched as our beloved leader was lowered into the ground. If the death of our chief wasn't bad enough for our district, later that year another famine fell upon the country. It arrived in spite of some newfound hope. In May 2004, our despised president Muluzi had finally stepped down and made way for new elections. Malawians then chose Bingu wa Mutharika as our new president. Mutharika was a respected man who'd earned degrees in economics in the United States and held high posts in the United Nations. President Mutharika pledged that change would soon come to Malawi, and one of the first things he did was reach out to us farmers. For the next planting season, his government began subsidizing fertilizer, and that meant my family could afford it for the first time in 3 years. Fertilizer coupons reduced the price from 4,000 kwacha to 950, with each family getting 4 coupons each. However, this scheme didn't stand a chance against the culture of corruption that already existed. Instead of distributing coupons to farmers, many local leaders hoarded them and sold them to people with the most cash. In December 2005, each farming family received their 4 coupons. To split up the work of hauling these heavy bags, my father and I each took 2, then waited in line all day at the Admark in Wimbe, where the government sold its maize and fertilizer. My father received his bags and left, but when it was time to get mine, the corrupt officials had given most of them away to their friends. They closed the shop early, and the farmers in line nearly began to riot. I ran up to the window so I could look inside to see what was happening, and just as I pressed my face to the glass, I felt a sharp pain in my back. One of the government security thugs was standing behind me, beating me with a hose pipe. "Get out of here, you little monkey," he yelled, swinging the hose like mad. He struck me again on the arms, then several times in the back. Pain shot down my spine, and I ran as fast as possible. Other guys, who'd been standing nearby, were caught against the wall and whipped mercilessly. Once I was safely away, I felt my face flush with anger. I wanted to kill him, but he was quite muscular, and I didn't stand a chance. "You're lucky my father is already gone," I shouted. We later managed to get a couple more bags of fertilizer and prepared to plant our crop. At first, the rains came like normal. We planted our seeds, going down the roads with our fertilizer, dumping a spoonful in a hole beside the seed station, and covering it back with soil. By January, the seedlings had begun to sprout, and were ankle high and showing their little arms, so happy to be feeding on such delicious rainwater and fertilizer. But just about the time they reached my father's knee, the rain stopped completely. The sun rose up every morning, angry, and blistered the poor seedlings, causing them to wither and crouch. Soon their leaves were dry and brittle. If we'd put a match to them, they'd have burned to a crisp. "Next year there'll be trouble," my father said. "I don't know if I can take another," I answered. It rained only a few more times in February, enough for many of the plants to produce a pith. But come Doway season, most of the ears were stunted and deformed. The harvest would be terrible. The government quickly promised intervention, but in the meantime people grew angry and scared. During the famine of 2002, the people of our area blamed the unpopular Muluzi government, venting their rage on the corrupt officials who'd sold our maize surplus. But this time, instead of acknowledging the cruel weather, they began blaming magic. And that meant blaming me. Superstitions are still very strong throughout the country, and several incidents in the news had stirred these fears even more. The previous famine had led to reports in the southern region that the government was banding with packs of vampires to steal people's blood, then selling it to international aid groups. Mobs had gone crazy. One old man was stoned to death and 3 Catholic priests were beaten. The government denied having any involvement with vampires, but that didn't seem to make these rumors go away. "No government can go about sucking the blood of its own people," President Muluzi had said at the time. "That's thuggery." Following this vampire episode, a strange beast appeared in Dawa and began attacking villages. Some said the beast looked like a hyena, others said it was a lion with the face of a dog. 3 people were mauled to death, and 16 others had their hands and legs ripped off from their bodies. The attacks caused thousands to flee their homes and sleep in the forest, where they were even more vulnerable to this alien creature. The police conducted all-night searches, and one evening they managed to corner the beast in a thicket. But according to the newspapers, whenever the police fired their rifles, the beast split into 3 separate animals and disappeared into the bush. Villagers then visited the Singanga, who conducted a powerful potion and flung it into the trees. The next morning the beast lay dead on the road, its corpse no bigger than a dog. When the elders tried to burn its body, no fire would consume it. The villagers returned to their homes. However, just when everybody thought they were safe, a second beast began attacking and killing again, sending thousands back into the bush. It was later concluded that the beast was the product of magic. A certain trader near Dawa had purchased some thunder and lightning from another powerful wizard and later refused to pay for it. In retaliation, the magic man had sent the beast against his family. All those who had been mangled and killed were his relatives. Following the strange beast of Dawa, many people across Malawi reported having their private parts stolen in the night, many of them waking up in the morning with their sheets bloody. Men who'd been drinking in bars were the easiest targets. As they stumbled home in the darkness, an evil creature, perhaps a gang of witch children, would pull them behind a tree and remove their parts with a knife. It was later revealed that most of the victims had been virgins, and their parts had been sold to witches. Satan worshippers, and business tycoons. This was all so worrisome that the opposition leader, the Honorable John Timbo, addressed the problem in Parliament, saying something like, "It is not acceptable to sell other people's private parts, especially while leaving your own." This wave of superstition and fear soon came to Wimbay. People said some witches were living near the trading center and using children for magic. One night, the witches instructed the children to attack an old man who was known as a good Christian. While the old man was sleeping, the children magically removed his head and used it for soccer. This often happens while we sleep. The witch children can take our heads and return them before morning, all without us knowing. It's a serious problem. This soccer game was no ordinary match, but a great tournament in Zambia among all the children of the devil. The trophy cup was filled with human meat, which was to be eaten on Christmas Day. The Malawian team was matched against the young witches of Tanzania. But as the game commenced and crowds hissed from the stands, something terrible happened. The ball deflated. When this happens, the head could not be returned, and so the old man died. After a new head was introduced, one of the Malawian children touched the ball with his hands at the 18-yard post, and that led to a penalty kick. The Tanzanians won the match 1-0. In the witch plane back to Wimbay, the other children mocked and cursed the young boy. "Why did you hand the ball?" they shouted. "We would have won." The other witches then beat the boy terribly with their magic. They were most upset about not getting the trophy cup of meat. The boy's grandfather happened to be a traditional chief in the neighboring village, so the witches gave the boy a choice. "Tonight you must kill your grandpa and bring us his meat, otherwise we'll eat you instead." The boy was so badly beaten by their magic that he awoke the next morning too exhausted to move. When his father came to rouse him from bed, the boy confessed everything. He explained the tournament, how the man's head had deflated, and the threats by the other witches. "An old man is dead in the village," he said, "and we are the ones who killed him. Now they want me to kill our grandfather." The parents became angry and reported the matter to their grandfather, the village headman. The child gave them the name of the witch who'd recruited him and the other children, and a mob was sent to his house. The man was beaten with clubs and sticks and barely escaped with his life. The boy's parents then reported the matter to Chief Wimbay, Gilbert's cousin, who'd since taken the throne. The chief investigated and made 3 arrests. These witches were convicted in the traditional court and made to pay a large amount of money. Sadly, our country's constitution doesn't have a clause that protects us from witchcraft. Because it's so difficult to prove, the authorities are limited in their investigations. They can eventually convict a wizard of violating the rights of a child, but never for kidnapping or murder. Hopefully one day that will change. Anyway, these incidents only heightened the fears and belief in evil powers. So in 2006, when the maize failed to grow and the likelihood of famine was strong, people started blaming magic. One afternoon in March, when the fields were withering in the sun, giant storm clouds began building in the distance. "Look, the clouds are gathering," people said. "Today we'll have rain." Yes, finally we're saved. We'd gone weeks without rain, and the sight of thick black thunderheads was something to celebrate. But just as these clouds began to pass overhead, a strong wind began to blow. It whipped up the red soil and threw it in our eyes and mouths, sending miniature cyclones tearing through our fields and across the courtyards. Little by little, this wind blew the clouds away. With nothing but the blazing sun left in the sky, a few people gathered at my house and pointed up to my windmill. The blades were spinning so fast the tower rocked and swayed. "Look, this giant fan has blown away the clouds. His machine is chasing away our rain. This machine is evil." "It's not a machine, it's a witch tower. The boy is calling witches." "Wait," I screamed, "the drought is all over the country. It's not just here. Electric wind is not the cause." "But we saw it with our own eyes," they said. I became very afraid these people would collect a mob and tear down my windmill, or worse. I kept a low profile for the next week, stayed inside, and even stopped the blades during the day so they wouldn't raise more suspicions. At the trading center, people approached Gilbert. "You can tell us the truth," said one trader. "Is he really a witch? Is it true what he says about his electric wind?" "He isn't a witch," Gilbert answered. "It's a windmill, a scientific machine. I helped him build it." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Go see for yourself." Many of them knew what my windmill was actually for, and a lot of them had even stood in line and charged their mobile phones. But pointing the blame at me helped them get over their fears about the upcoming famine. Luckily, not long after that, the government stepped in and released tons of maize on the market. A few months later, some aid agencies arrived and offered further assistance. No one starved or died. A catastrophe had been avoided, but still, it revealed the kind of backwardness in our people that really frustrates me. Sadly, magic was often the scapegoat for another great tragedy in Malawi, the spread of HIV and AIDS. Around this period, about 20% of all Malawians were infected, and many thousands died each year. Not only had it killed tens of thousands of our teachers and further deprived our students of a good education, by 2008, AIDS had also killed many of our national entertainers, including many musicians, robbing our country of one of its proudest treasures. People died from AIDS because of stubbornness and lack of education. For many years, our villages didn't have proper clinics that addressed HIV because of the stigmas attached to it. People weren't taught to use protection during sexual relations, and once they became sick, many fell into denial. Others visited magic men who recognized the HIV symptoms right away, but still told the patient, "You're right, brother, you've been bewitched. Luckily, I have just the thing." These wizards also claimed to treat other serious ailments requiring medical attention, which led to many senseless deaths in our country. One of the biggest was diarrhea. A person would see the wizard and complain of serious pains in his or her stomach. "Oh, I know what's wrong," the wizard says. "You have a snail." "A snail?" "I'm almost positive. Do you feel movement in your intestines?" "Of course. The pain is terrible." "That's a snail. We must remove it at once." "Then do it quick. It hurts so bad." So the wizard goes into his bag of roots, powders, and bones, and pulls out a light bulb. "Lift up your shirt." Without plugging the light bulb into anything, the wizard begins moving it slowly across the person's stomach, as if to illuminate something that only he can detect. "There it is. Can you see the snail moving?" "Huh? Can't you see it moving its antennae?" "That explains why you're crying so much." "Oh, yes, I think I can see it. Yes, there it is." The wizard goes into his bag again and pulls out a bundle of dried roots, which he dips into a jar of water. After some minutes, he splashes this magic potion onto the person's stomach. The moment this water comes in contact with the snail, it will die and come out. After a few minutes, he looks up. "All better?" "Yes, I think the snail is gone. I don't feel it moving." "Good. That will be 3,000 kwacha." There was such a stigma attached to AIDS that most people who suffered it didn't seek any medical help beyond what they could get from the singanga. You'd see them in the trading center looking very thin, their hair turning yellow and pale, and the color leaving their eyes. Sometimes you see them loaded in the backs of pickups bound for Kasungu Hospital, never to return. This lack of education also led to harsh teasing and discrimination by the population. Often, young kids would harass people on the roads who appeared thin and weak and showed sign of being Wakachilombo, a person infected by a virus. "Look at the Wakachilombo with AIDS," they'd shout. "He's gonna die. Mister, you better prepare your grave." One afternoon, by playing Bayo in the trading center, some health personnel from Wimbe Clinic approached us boys and began chatting. They said they were starting a youth club to encourage people to get tested. "Why don't you boys join us and sensitize your community?" they said. "We need help spreading the truth." That day, the Wimbe Youth Friendly Health Services Club was born, becoming one of my most cherished activities. We began meeting every Monday and learned about prevention and treatment of HIV and how to approach others on the subject. The class was filled with other kids our age, most of whom had also dropped out of school due to lack of funds. Jeffrey and Gilbert were also members. I was so happy to be in a classroom type environment again where I could learn and socialize with others, where we could show our smarts and joke around with our pals. Just as the windmill and scrapyard had done, the classes worked to replace school in my mind and kept me focused. I put everything into my club. The doctors at the clinic were so impressed by our enthusiasm, they asked me to write a play to help persuade people to get tested. Over several days, I prepared a great production, more in my mind than on paper, which I titled Veon Kanedwe Apusito, or simply Don't Judge the Book by Its Cover. The play was performed 2 weeks later in the Trading Center. Gilbert and I put up posters announcing the show, and I even asked our new chief, Gilbert's cousin, to summon a few Gule-Wamkulu to help draw the cords. The morning of the play, we got our gang of actors together and marched through the trading center shouting, "Come one, come all! See the HIV drama! See the acrobatics of Gule-Wamkulu!" We set up in the market center soon. About 500 people had gathered around. Many of the shops even closed during the performance. The play involved a certain married couple in the capital Lilongwe, played by my friends Christopher and Nesse. The husband sends his wife to the village to grow some maize. Well, as you know, life can be very difficult in the villages. People get hungry, the work is hard, and the sun is very hot. Not accustomed to this kind of farm life, the wife loses a lot of weight. When she returns home, the husband becomes angry. "Why are you so thin?" he asks. "The village is tough," she says. "You're lying. I think you've been sleeping with other men, and now you have AIDS." Little did the wife know, but while she was gone, her husband had been spending every night in the bars of Area 47, where he'd slept with many prostitutes. The wife pleads her case with her husband, denying his accusations. But the husband doesn't accept her story. "Go back to the village," he tells her. "If you want to sleep around, then go and do it. Get out of my house." Luckily, a friend arrives just in time and sees them fighting. This was my part. "Wait a minute, brother. What's the problem?" he says. "I sent this woman to the village to grow maize, and look how thin she became. She says the farming was hard work and there was no food in the village, but I say she has AIDS, and I'm not staying with her any more." The friend says, "Brother, you can't tell if someone has AIDS just by looking at them. It could be hunger, tuberculosis, or many other things. The only way to know is to be tested at the local volunteer counseling and testing center." "Fine," says the husband. "We'll go down there and prove this once and for all." The husband thinks because he is so muscular, all those prostitutes in Area 47 haven't heard him, but after being tested at the VCT center, sure enough, the doctor, played by Gilbert, informs the husband that he is HIV positive. His wife is negative. "You're cheating me," he tells the doctor. "This can't be true." "I wouldn't tell you a lie," the doctor says, "but don't worry, this isn't the end. You can still live your life if you play by a few simple rules." The wife becomes afraid. "There's no way I can stay with you. You're right, husband, I should leave." "Don't be foolish," said the doctor. "You can stay together. Just be careful and use protective measures." The wife is so relieved and gives the husband a hug. "I still love you," she says. "I'll stay with you until death do us part." When the play was over, the crowd shouted and cheered and threw handfuls of paper in the air. Once we acted clear the stage, the Guli-Wamkulu closed the show with an electrifying grand finale. I won't say our little play inspired loads of people to be tested right away, but it did help change attitudes. These days, with the help of government programs and new VCT training centers, more people are being educated and tested, and age isn't such a taboo. Even the magic men started sending their clients to the clinics, preaching science and medicine over their charms. My popularity as an inventor and activist soon attracted other opportunities. Not long after the play, one of the teachers at Winbay Primary asked if I'd be interested in starting a science club for the students. He'd been impressed by my windmill and wanted me to build one on campus. "The students look up to you," he said. "Your skills in science will really challenge their brains." "Sure," I said, "I'll do it." The windmill I created at the school was small, much like my first radio experiment, with blades made from a metal maize pail and a radio motor for a generator. I attached it to a blue gum pole and ran the wires into an old Panasonic two-battery radio that I'd repaired. I did this during recess one morning when all the kids were in the grove playing soccer. As I worked, a crowd gathered around to watch. When I connected the wires, the music blasted through the schoolyard. "Keep quiet, I want to listen," they screamed. "Don't push me. Let me see." The windmill not only allowed students to listen to music and news, they could also charge their parents mobile phones. Each Monday, I told them about the basics of science and explained the importance of innovation, like how ink was first made using charcoal. I also demonstrated the cup and string experiment featured in my books to help explain how a telephone works. I walked them through the steps of how I built everything using simple scrapyard materials, and I'd hope I'd inspire them to build something themselves. If I can teach my neighbors how to build windmills, I thought, what else can we build together? "In science we invent and create," I said. We make new things that can benefit our situation. If we can all invent something and put it to work, we can change Malawi. I later found out that some of the students had been so inspired by the windmill in the schoolyard, they went home and made toy windmills themselves. I began to imagine what it would be like if all those pinwheels had been real, if every home and shop in the trading center had a spinning machine to catch the wind above the rooftops. At night, the entire valley would sparkle with light like a clear, starry sky. More and more, bringing electricity to my people no longer seemed like a madman's dream.